The November wind cut through Millfield like a razor, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the bitter promise of an early winter. Sarah McKenna stood on the wooden platform in the town square, her hands bound behind her back, the rough hemp rope chafing against her wrists. The crowd below murmured like a restless sea, their faces turned upward with the cold curiosity of those who had come to witness justice, or what they called justice. "Sarah McKenna," Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed across the square, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "You stand accused of theft. The penalty, as decreed by territorial law, is death by hanging." Sarah's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand straight. At 28, she had already buried a husband and watched consumption claim her only child. The single loaf of bread she had taken from Morrison's store lay as evidence on a small table beside the gallows. Such a small thing to die for, yet it had meant the difference between life and starvation. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising. "Get on with it!" someone shouted from the back. A woman in a faded blue bonnet spat into the dirt. "Thieving widow deserves what's coming." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the sting of tears she refused to shed. She thought of her husband Thomas, killed in a mining accident 3 years ago, and little Emma, whose cough had grown worse through that terrible winter until it silenced forever. She had nothing left, no family, no friends willing to risk association with a condemned woman, no hope. Sheriff Coleman adjusted the noose, his movements mechanical and practiced. The executioner, a heavy-set man named Pike, stepped forward with the black hood. The crowd fell silent, anticipating the final moment. "Any last words?" Coleman asked, though his tone suggested he wished to be done with the proceedings. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to pray or to curse this unforgiving town, when a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. People turned, craning their necks to see what was happening. Shouts of alarm rippled through the crowd. "Indians!" someone screamed. "Apache!" The crowd scattered like startled birds, women grabbing their children, men reaching for weapons that weren't there. Through the chaos, a figure emerged. Tall, lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the wilderness rather than the confines of civilization. The Apache hunter stood at the foot of the gallows, his long black hair bound with leather, his weathered face marked by years of sun and hardship. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt, a rifle slung across his back. Most striking were his eyes, dark, intense, and filled with a quiet authority that made even Sheriff Coleman hesitate. "This woman," the Apache said in careful English, his voice carrying despite its soft tone, "she will come with me." Sheriff Coleman recovered from his surprise, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Now hold on there. This is a legal execution. You got no business here, Apache." The hunter's gaze never wavered. "Your law says she dies for bread. My law says the hungry should be fed. I claim her under the old agreements, the treaties your people signed but do not honor. Treaties don't mean nothing when it comes to our justice," Coleman spat, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The Apache stepped closer to the platform, and Sarah saw something in his face. Not pity exactly, but recognition, as if he understood what it meant to be cast out, to be judged by laws that showed no mercy. "Your justice," the hunter repeated, and there was something almost like sadness in his voice. "You hang a woman for trying to live. Is this the civilization you are so proud of?" The crowd had backed away, forming a wide circle around the square. Some men had returned with rifles, but they seemed uncertain whether to aim them. The territorial treaties were complex things, full of clauses and compromises that few understood completely. Sheriff Coleman looked around at the expectant faces, weighing his options. The Apache stood perfectly still, his presence filling the square with a tension that seemed to press against everyone's chest. "I cannot let a condemned prisoner go," Coleman said finally. "Law is law." The Apache nodded as if he had expected this response. In one fluid motion, he pulled a leather pouch from his belt and tossed it onto the platform. It landed with the unmistakable clink of coins. "Payment," he said simply. "For the bread, for the debt." Coleman stared at the pouch, then at the Apache, then at Sarah. The crowd murmured, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. This was not how executions were supposed to proceed. "It ain't about the money," Coleman protested weakly. "It is always about something," the Apache replied. "Fear, hunger, power. But this woman, she took bread to live. Nothing more. In my people's way, this makes her someone to help, not someone to kill." Sarah found her voice at last, hoarse from fear and cold. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom she was speaking. The Apache looked up at her then, and for a moment, the chaos of the square faded away. In his eyes, she saw something she had almost forgotten existed: compassion without judgment, strength without cruelty. "Choose," he said to Sheriff Coleman, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Honor your law of death, or accept my payment and let justice serve life instead of feeding it to the earth." The wind picked up, rattling the gallows timbers and sending dead leaves skittering across the wooden platform. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, loud as thunder in her ears. The crowd waited, suspended between spectacle and mercy. Sheriff Coleman's hand hovered over his gun, his face a mask of indecision and growing anger. The Apache remained motionless, a figure carved from stone and will, and in that moment of balance, with death on one side and an uncertain salvation on the other, Sarah McKenna's fate hung as surely as any noose, waiting for a choice that would change everything. Sheriff Coleman's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the leather pouch, the weight of 100 watching eyes pressing down on him. The Apache hunter remained perfectly still, but Sarah could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the readiness of a man prepared for whatever came next. "This is irregular," Coleman muttered, hefting the pouch. The coins clinked softly, more money than Morrison's store saw in a month. "Highly irregular." "But not illegal," came a voice from the crowd. Judge Hartwell pushed through the gathered townspeople, his black coat billowing in the wind. At 63, he was one of the few men in Millfield who had actually read the territorial treaties. Under the Indian Commerce Clause and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, restitution can be made for property crimes. The crowd shifted uneasily. They had come to see a hanging, not a legal discussion. "Judge," Sheriff Coleman said, relief evident in his voice, "what are you saying exactly?" Judge Hartwell climbed onto the platform, his movements careful and deliberate. He examined the pouch, then looked at the Apache hunter. "What is your name, sir?" "Nalnish," the Apache replied. "It means he who works hard." "And you claim responsibility for this woman's debt?" "I do." The judge nodded slowly. "Then by territorial law, the debt is satisfied. The woman is free to go." A roar of protest erupted from the crowd. "That ain't right," someone shouted. "She's a thief." But even as they complained, people began to drift away. The spectacle was over, and the cold was seeping through their coats. With shaking hands, Sheriff Coleman untied Sarah's bonds. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had cut into her skin. She stumbled as feeling returned to her hands, and Nalnish stepped forward, steadying her with a gentle touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, but said nothing, his attention focused on the dispersing crowd. Some of the men still lingered, their faces hard with disappointment and anger. Nalnish recognized the look. It was the same expression he had seen on cavalry faces just before they opened fire. "We should go," he said quietly to Sarah. Before they find courage in numbers, Judge Hartwell overheard. "I'll walk with you to the edge of town," he offered. "My presence might discourage any hasty decisions." They made an odd procession. The elderly judge in his formal coat, the Apache hunter in his buckskins, and Sarah in her threadbare dress and woolen shawl. The few townspeople who remained stepped aside as they passed, their eyes following the group with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. As they walked, Sarah studied her unlikely savior. Nalnish moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in his own skin, his moccasined feet making no sound on the dirt road. He was perhaps 35, she guessed, with strong hands and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested life had not been entirely unkind to him. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the question bursting from her before she could stop it. "Why did you help me?" Nalnish glanced at her, then at the judge walking beside them. "My grandmother always said that we are measured not by what we take, but by what we give when we have little to spare." "But you don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied. "I know what it looks like when someone has nothing left but still fights to live. I know what it sounds like when a crowd calls for blood instead of justice." Judge Hartwell cleared his throat. "If I may ask, Mr. Nalnish, where will you take her? The townspeople, they won't forget this easily. My cabin is 2 days' ride north in the Sangre de Cristo foothills. She will be safe there." And then? Nalnish was quiet for a long moment. Then she decides what comes next. They reached the edge of town, where the neat rows of houses gave way to scrubland and scattered pine trees. Judge Hartwell stopped, breathing heavily from the walk. "Mrs. McKenna," he said formally, "you are free to go where you will, but I would advise against returning to Millfield for some time." Sarah nodded, understanding. There would be no welcome for her here, not after this. Everything she had known, her small rented room, the few possessions she hadn't already sold, the familiar streets where she had walked with her husband and daughter, all of it was lost to her now. "I have a horse," Nalnish said, gesturing toward a stand of trees where a paint mare waited patiently, her breath steaming in the cold air. "She is strong enough to carry 2. Sarah had never ridden double with a man who wasn't her husband, but the alternative was freezing to death in the November wilderness. She allowed Nalnish to help her onto the horse behind him, her hands gripping his belt as the mare began to move. The town fell away behind them, and with it the last remnants of Sarah's old life. The landscape opened up, rolling hills covered in yellowing grass, stands of aspen trees already bare for winter, and in the distance the snow-capped peaks of the mountains. The air was thin and clean, so different from the smoky closeness of Millfield. They rode in silence for the first hour, following a trail that was little more than a deer path winding through the foothills. Sarah had expected to feel afraid. She was alone with a stranger, traveling into unknown territory, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Nalnish rode with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a hidden spring, the scattered bones of an elk. But mostly he let the silence of the wilderness speak for itself. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nalnish guided the mare off the main trail toward a sheltered grove of pine trees. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, dismounting and offering his hand to help Sarah down. "Tomorrow we reach the cabin." Sarah slid from the horse, her legs unsteady after hours of riding. Everything felt surreal. This morning she had been preparing to die, and now she was in the wilderness with an Apache hunter who had saved her life. Nalnish moved efficiently, unsaddling the mare and hobbling her where she could graze. He gathered dry wood and built a small fire with practiced ease, then produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. "It's not much," he said, offering her a share. Sarah accepted the food gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since yesterday. The jerky was tough but flavorful, seasoned with unfamiliar spices that warmed her from the inside. As the fire crackled between them, she found herself studying his face in the dancing light. There were scars there, a thin line across his cheek, another on his jaw, but also kindness in the way he tended the fire, making sure she stayed warm. "You saved my life," she said finally. Nalnish poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. "Perhaps you saved mine as well." "How?" He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost lost in the whisper of wind through the pines. "For 2 years, I have lived alone in these mountains. My wife died of the spotted sickness, my children too. I thought perhaps I had forgotten how to care about someone else's pain." He looked at her across the fire. "Today I remembered." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness this time, but of recognition. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to carry grief like a stone in your chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "about your family." He nodded, accepting her sympathy without the polite deflection she was used to from white society. In the growing darkness, with the fire warming their faces and the vast silence of the mountains around them, 2 wounded souls had found each other. Neither spoke of love. It was far too soon for such words, and both carried too much sorrow for easy sentiment. But something had begun between them, fragile as a snowflake and just as beautiful. As the stars emerged overhead, brilliant and countless in the clear mountain air, Sarah McKenna fell asleep, wrapped in Nalnish's spare blanket, no longer alone in the world. The cabin materialized from the morning mist like something from a dream. Built of pine logs and river stone, it nestled into a natural clearing, where a clear stream bubbled over smooth rocks. Snow had begun to fall during their final hour of travel, dusting the roof and windowsills with white. Sarah slid from the horse, her breath forming clouds in the crystalline air. After 2 days of travel, every muscle in her body ached, but she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Safety. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Nalnish nodded, dismounting and beginning to unsaddle the mare. "My grandfather chose this place. He said the mountains would protect those who respected them." The cabin was simple but well built, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and windows positioned to catch the morning light. Inside, Sarah found the space divided into 2 rooms. The main living area with its fireplace and simple furniture, and a smaller sleeping alcove separated by a hanging blanket. "You take the bed," Nalnish said, carrying their supplies inside. "I'll sleep by the fire." Sarah wanted to protest, but exhaustion was weighing heavily on her. She had slept little during their journey, every shadow potentially hiding pursuers from Millfield, every sound making her start awake. That first week passed in a blur of snow and silence. The storm that had begun during their arrival intensified, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary with walls of white. Sarah had expected to feel trapped, but instead she found herself beginning to heal. Nalnish proved to be an excellent host. He cooked simple but nourishing meals, venison stew with wild onions, cornbread baked in a Dutch oven, herbal teas that warmed her from the inside out. He never pressed her to talk about her past, never asked intrusive questions about her life before the gallows. Instead, they fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for practical tasks, tending the fire, checking on the mare, preparing meals. Afternoons, when the light was good, Sarah would mend their clothes, while Nalnish worked on repairing tools or crafting new arrows for his bow. Evenings belonged to quiet conversation by the fire. "Tell me about your grandmother," Sarah said one night, watching snowflakes swirl past the window. "The one who taught you about giving." Nalnish smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Grandmother Ayana. She was small, barely came to my shoulder, but she could stare down a mountain lion. When I was young, maybe 8 years old, we found a coyote caught in a trap. Its leg was badly injured." He paused to add another log to the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I wanted to put it out of its misery. It was suffering, and coyotes sometimes stole our food. But Grandmother Ayana spent 3 hours freeing it, then 2 more days nursing it back to health. When I asked her why, she said, 'Because we can. Because when we have the power to choose between cruelty and kindness, we show who we truly are.'" Sarah absorbed this, thinking of the crowd in Millfield who had gathered to watch her die. What happened to the coyote? It lived, and every winter after that, when game was scarce, we would find fresh kills left near our camp. Grandmother said the coyote was returning the gift. Do you believe that? Nalnish considered the question seriously. I believe that kindness creates more kindness. Whether the coyote remembered us or not, Grandmother's choice changed me. And someday, perhaps my choices will change someone else. As the days passed, Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing such a change. Nalnish had lived alone for 2 years, but his natural instincts toward hospitality and care hadn't disappeared. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge. She also discovered that grief had its own seasons. Some days, the weight of losing Thomas and Emma pressed down on her so heavily she could barely function. On those days, Nalnish would quietly take over the cooking and cleaning, never commenting on her tears or asking her to explain her sorrow. Other days, she found herself laughing at his stories or feeling genuinely curious about the world beyond her pain. These moments of lightness surprised her with their intensity, as if she were rediscovering emotions she had thought were lost forever. I used to be different, she told him one evening, watching him whittle a new handle for a broken knife. Before Thomas died, before Emma got sick, I don't know. Happier, I suppose. More trusting. Grief changes us, Nalnish replied without looking up from his work. But it doesn't erase who we were. Sometimes it just takes time to find our way back. What if I can't? What if this... She gestured at herself. What if this broken person is all that's left? He set down his knife and looked at her directly. Sarah, you took bread to survive when you had nothing left. You stood on a gallows with dignity when a crowd called for your death. You came into these mountains with a stranger because you chose to trust instead of surrender. You are not broken, you are healing. The words hit her with unexpected force, bringing tears to her eyes. When was the last time someone had seen strength in her actions instead of weakness? When had anyone looked at her with such fundamental respect? Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. As the snow continued to fall, Sarah adjusted to the rhythms of mountain life, early bedtimes, dawn risings, and the quiet that filled the spaces between her conversations with Nalnish. She began to notice his protective nature, like how he positioned himself between her and the door, or woke early to stoke the fire so she wouldn't wake to the cold. She also observed his careful use of English, ensuring she understood him perfectly. One evening, as they shared pine needle tea by the fire, Sarah studied his weathered features, noticing how his gentleness stood out. The same hands that could handle weapons with skill were tender when caring for her. She asked about the meaning of his name, and he explained it meant he who works hard, a name his grandmother gave him, recognizing his future resilience. Inside the cabin, warmth grew between them, though they didn't speak of it directly. It was new and fragile. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was ready to face whatever came next, not as a broken woman fleeing death, but as someone given a second chance. And perhaps, if she was lucky, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world around the cabin into something magical. The snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant colors, and the air filled with the sound of returning birds. Sarah had been in the cabin for 5 months, and in that time, both she and Nalnish had undergone their own quiet transformation. The change had been so gradual that Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly when her feelings had shifted from gratitude to something deeper. Perhaps it was the morning she woke to find him sitting by her bed, watching over her while she recovered from a fever. Or maybe it was the evening he taught her to string his bow, his hands covering hers as he showed her the proper technique, both of them acutely aware of the warmth passing between them. The fever broke in the night, Nalnish had said that morning, relief evident in his voice. You were talking in your sleep, calling for Emma. Sarah had turned away, embarrassed by her vulnerability. I'm sorry. I know the dreams disturb you. They don't disturb me, he replied gently. They remind me that love doesn't die just because the person we love is no longer with us. Your daughter lives in your heart, Sarah. That's not something to apologize for. It was moments like these that made Sarah realize how profoundly different Nalnish was from any man she had known. Her husband Thomas had been a good man, but he had possessed the emotional simplicity common to many frontier men. Love was demonstrated through protection and provision, not through the careful tending of another person's grief. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself watching Nalnish with new eyes. She noticed how he would pause in his work to listen when she spoke, giving her words the weight of genuine attention. She saw how he had quietly altered his routines to accommodate her presence, rising earlier to give her privacy for washing, checking with her before making decisions that affected them both, always ensuring she felt like a guest rather than a burden. The morning she realized she was in love with him, Sarah was gathering herbs by the stream while Nalnish repaired the cabin's roof. She looked up at the sound of his laughter. He was talking to a squirrel that had been chattering at him indignantly, and felt her heart perform a strange, fluttering dance in her chest. The revelation terrified her. Thomas had been dead for 3 years, Emma for 2. Was it too soon? Was she betraying their memory by opening her heart to someone new? And even if she wasn't, what future could there be for a white widow and an Apache hunter in a world that had tried to kill her for stealing bread? That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing their usual quiet companionship, Sarah felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against her chest. Nalnish seemed to sense her mood, glancing at her with the perceptive attention he had shown since the day he saved her life. Something troubles you, he observed, not a question, but a gentle invitation to share. Sarah struggled with how to begin. Nalnish, what happens when summer comes, when the trails are clear and people might come looking? He was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with his usual stick. Do you want to leave? No, she said, the word emerging with more force than she had intended. No, I don't want to leave, but I don't want to bring danger to you either. Sarah. He set down the stick and turned to face her fully. I knew the dangers when I took you from that gallows. I chose to accept them. But why? The question that had haunted her for months finally broke free. You could have let them hang me. You could have stayed safe in your mountains. Why did you risk everything for a stranger? Nalnish was silent for so long that Sarah began to regret asking. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. The day my wife died, I was hunting in the high country. She had been sick for weeks, but that morning she seemed better. She told me to go, said we needed the meat for winter. When I returned, he paused, his hands clenched in his lap. She was gone, and with her, my children. The sickness took them all while I was chasing deer in the mountains. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, understanding the weight of his guilt. For 2 years, Thomas had been consumed by guilt, believing that if he had been a better husband and father, his loved ones would still be alive. But when he saw Sarah on the platform, he realized he could save someone this time, and the guilt began to fade as he became invested in her as a person, not just as a way to atone for his past. Sarah, feeling the weight of this truth, confessed, "I love you," and Nalnish smiled, revealing that he had loved her for weeks, but was unsure if it was too soon. Sarah had feared that loving Nalnish would mean forgetting her late husband and daughter, but Nalnish reassured her that love doesn't diminish other love, it grows alongside it. They talked about the challenges of their relationship, cultural differences, societal judgment, but they both agreed it would be difficult, but not impossible. Sarah, for the first time, could see a future, not just survival, but a life built on love and respect. Fearing the townspeople from Millfield might eventually come for her, Sarah voiced her concerns, but Nalnish promised they would face it together. He reassured her that whatever hardships lay ahead, he would rather face them with her than alone. Their conversation turned to marriage, and Sarah asked, "When?" Nalnish said they could marry whenever she was ready, even tomorrow, if the judge could come. Sarah, filled with a sense of renewed hope, replied, "Soon." Outside, spring continued its cycle of renewal, and inside, 2 hearts found healing in each other. Love had proven stronger than loss and prejudice, and Sarah understood that her life was beginning again, not ending. As the coyote howled in the distance, Sarah thought that some acts of salvation are really stories of love, and together they had found their way home.